This meeting is being recorded.
A very good morning to all from a warm and humid Lucknow. On behalf of Chairman Strive and all members of the organization, I welcome you all to this seminar on Russia, on the Russian-Ukraine conflict. There is more to it than meets the eye. A special welcome to our esteemed guests, Dr. Christin Fair, Andrew Kourtunov, and Lieutenant General Vinod Bhatia. I'm sure today will be a learning experience from us. The Russia-Ukraine conflict is almost on for the last 4 months with no sign of abating. Casualties continue on both sides. Frankly, there are more questions than answers. Let me touch on a few issues. Firstly, what triggered the conflict? There are different views flowing from the West as also from Russia. Second, what was the possible Russian aim? Putin had announced right in the beginning that he has no intention of occupying Ukraine. Was the aim to liberate the breakaway provinces and create a land route to Crimea? If so, is he near to achieving his aim? Will he declare a unilateral ceasefire? Will it be accepted? What are the intentions of the West? Talks have been called off. Russian media blames the West for it, while the West blames Russia. Does the West seek to create a second Afghanistan for Russia? After all, Ukraine is being provided weapons which are far more in quality and quantity than the Taliban ever were. Is the West's intention to degrade Russia's comprehensive national power, thereby removing threat to Europe and making the Russo-China alliance history? Is it possible to isolate a nation like Russia, endowed with an abundance of resources in this modern age of globalization? Will sanctions work as Europe needs Russian oil and gas, while the US needs Russian mineral fertilizers? The ruble currently remains amongst the best performing currencies. Sanctions post the occupation of Crimea were ineffective. Can Europe truly cut off Russian energy supplies without damaging their own economy? Today we've come across protests in France, in UK, on the impact of the sanctions on Russia. Will the world, mainly Asian and African nations, join hands in making sanctions effective? After all nations consider their national interests first. Ukraine, in a number of cases, is too far removed to be of any major concern. Is the conflict now creating hurdles for India to choose sides? Will the world be able to press India to join in sanctions as also condemnation of Russia? Jaishankar has emphasized on multiple occasions that India will continue to take the middle path. Is that the right approach? Should the world not be looking at restoring peace and initiating dialogue rather than prolonging the war, enhancing destruction of Ukraine and loss of innocent lives? What could be a possible end state? Lessons from the conflict are immense, whether at the strategic, operational, or tactical level. Can these be imbibed to prevent future conflicts or even in future conflicts? These and many more issues continue to plague strategic thinkers. I'm certain that these and possibly even beyond this would be cleared when we hear our speakers today. The panel we have, comprising of Dr. Christin Fair, Andrew Kourtunov, and Lieutenant General Vinod Bhatia, is possibly the best that could ever come together on a common platform to share perspectives from different sides. Without taking much more time, I now hand over to Lieutenant General Dushyant Singh to conduct the day's proceedings.
Thank you, General Kakkad. A very good morning to our distinguished guests, Dr. Andrew Kourtunov, Director General, Russian International Affairs Council, Dr. Christin Fair, Professor in Security Studies Program, within the Edmund A. Walsh School of Foreign Service, Georgetown University, USA, and Lieutenant General Vinod Bhatia, PVSM, AVSM, SM from former Director, Center of Joint Warfare Studies and the DGMO of India. The other participants who have joined us on this platform and YouTube and Facebook. The Russia-Ukraine war, as General Kakkad has already alluded to, has become so complex that there are layers and layers of issues which have emerged in its bits and pieces over time. Similarly, assessments and predictions of many have gone awry, which is in conformity with the prediction with the old adage that it is very easy to start a war, but it is very difficult to end the war. Likewise, the dimensions of the war are having a very profound impact on almost every domain, be it the world order, regional alignments, economic domain, especially the energy and the food sector. And above all, the world is witnessing such a war after Second World War, and that too on the European soil. Even as I speak, the conflict with Russia, which Russia refers to, to it as special military operations and Ukraine as war, is into its 116th day. As we talk, the estimated casualties, we must take these figures with a pinch of salt. In the war of civilians is approximately 27,000 people. The foreign nationals are around 34. 11,000 Ukrainian forces have perished, and almost 16,000 plus Russian allied forces have also lost their life. Russia has slowed down the tempo of operations, but it is now in control of major part of eastern and southern Ukraine. That is just to give you all an idea as to where the war stands as of today. A number of questions are plaguing the mind. Some of them have already been highlighted by General Kakkad. These questions are, how will the war end? I think that is one of the most primary concerns of almost everybody. Are economic sanctions really capable of preventing or deterring war in an economically interlinked world? The perception that an all-out war or military invasion is a thing of the past has been turned on its head, and that too in Europe. What will be the long-term impact on the global economy due to the double impact of war and COVID, which seems to be raising its heads again back in India? What will be the shape of future world order? What will be the efficacy of UN, which has again taken a beating? How will China finally react to the brewing Taiwan crisis in Indo-Pacific? What will be the shape of new emerging regional alignments? Above all, what is going to be the impact on India, on which we will have General Bhatia speaking to us? To answer all these questions, we have this distinguished panel with us. And without much ado, I would like to invite Dr. Andrew Kourtunov, Director General, Russian International Affairs Council, to speak to us on this issue. But before I invite him, I would like to introduce Dr. Kourtunov to everybody. Dr. Andrew Kourtunov graduated from the Moscow State Institute of International Relations in 1979 and completed his postgraduate studies at the Institute for US and Canada Studies of the USSR Academy of Sciences in 1982. He holds a PhD in history. Dr. Kourtunov completed internships at the Soviet embassies in London and Washington, and also at the permanent delegation of USSR to the United Nations. From 1982 to 1985, Dr. Kourtunov held various positions in the Institute for US and Canada Studies, including its deputy director. He taught at universities around the world, including the University of California, Berkeley. In addition, he led several public organizations involved in higher education, social sciences, social development, etc. Since 2011, Dr. Andrew Kourtunov has been the Director General of RIAC. He is a member of expert and supervisory committee and boards of trustees of several Russian and international organizations. His academic interests include contemporary international relations and Russian foreign policy. We are fortunate to have him amongst us to speak on this burning topic, the genesis of Russia-Ukraine war, from the Russian perspective, the end state, and the recommendations for Russia. Over to you, Dr. Kourtunov. The floor is all yours, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me start with saying that I'm grateful for having a chance to be here and to share my views on the Russian-Ukrainian conflict with respected Indian scholars and opinion makers in this country. Let me start from the very outset that I consider this conflict to be an epic tragedy for the two nations. I think that any conflict is a failure of diplomacy. We should have explored other opportunities to resolve the problems between Moscow and Kiev, although these problems are not easy to resolve. But I think that none of these problems can justify a military conflict with increasing number of casualties on both sides and also increasing losses for the civilian population and for the infrastructure of Ukraine. Let me share with you some of my thinking on the genesis of this conflict. I completed a paper last year in which I tried to make some comparisons between the relations of India and Pakistan on the one hand and Russia and Ukraine on the other. I just sent a link to this paper, which is published on my website in English. Of course, any comparisons might look a little bit artificial, but nevertheless, I think that there are certain similarities between the two cases. Now, let me very briefly address some of the questions that have been raised here. And I have to tell you, in the spirit of full disclosure, that I don't have answers to most of the questions. And I think in certain ways, I am as ignorant about the intentions of Mr. Putin as the rest of us. The official statements coming from the Kremlin on the goals of Russia in this conflict are deliberately vague and ambiguous. They are talking about providing for security of the people of Donbass. They're talking about preventing Ukraine from joining NATO and preventing an active military technical cooperation between Ukraine and the North Atlantic Alliance. They're talking about such notions as demilitarisation of Ukraine and denazification of the Ukrainian society. But it's not quite clear what is meant specifically by these very general and unclear statements. So we can, sorry, we can speculate about what the real goals of the Kremlin are in Ukraine. And essentially, you know, there are two very different approaches to what the Russian army might want to achieve in this conflict. The first goal is what I would call minimalist. That would mean to get control over the territory of Donbass in the old administrative borders of the two Ukrainian regions, the Donetsk region and the Lugansk region. And a lot of fighting which takes place right now in the east of Ukraine is supposed to lead Russia to this goal. We see that in Lugansk, in the north, this mission has already been almost completely accomplished. In the south, in Donbass, there is still a lot of territory to cover. But is it good enough? Is it something that the Kremlin might be satisfied with if and when this goal is met? There are doubts about whether it really constitutes the end goal of the Russian operation in Ukraine, because we now see that rather large territories of adjacent Ukrainian regions, including Zaporozhye and especially the southern region of Kherson, are under complete Russian control. So if the idea was to build a land bridge to Crimea, the land bridge is definitely there, and it's not likely that the Kremlin is ready to vacate these territories that it has established its control on. Moreover, what we see, and this is something that disturbs me a lot, we see a kind of creeping annexation of southern Ukraine, which is being integrated into the Russian Federation quite actively. So those who believe that Russia is more ambitious in Ukraine argue that the goal of the operation is not to secure Donbass, but rather to reset the Ukrainian state project, to change the political system of Ukraine, and to make sure that Ukraine will become a friendly country after the conflict is over. One should also add that this conflict is perceived in the Kremlin, and not only in the Kremlin, it is perceived in the Russian society as a conflict not between Russia and Ukraine, but as a conflict between Russia and the West. And the perception is that Ukraine is a kind of artificial state which exists only because it has a life support system provided by the West, and that the West has already become a party to this conflict, given the scale of the military support that the West renders to Ukraine, the scale of economic, diplomatic, and even intelligence support that Kiev receives from the NATO alliance and from the United States. The perception in the Russian leadership apparently is that it is the West which has launched a hybrid war against Russia, and this war was not launched on February 24th of this year, but much earlier. So that justifies, quote unquote, justifies Russian actions on the Ukrainian soil. So this is the perception which is presented in the official narrative of the conflict provided by the Russian leadership. And I have to say that so far the Russian society, the Russian public, with some exceptions, of course, generally buys this narrative. So this war becomes not just a land grab war. It's not a war between Russia and a neighboring country, but it becomes an existential conflict between Russia and the West. And that makes particularly difficult to find a compromise in how the war might end. Now, let me just very briefly get to the Ukrainian side. And I have many contacts in Kiev, and including people who are connected to the negotiating process. I think that one of the problems with Ukraine is that Ukraine has clearly won the information war against Russia, but the Ukrainian society made a kind of extrapolation of this victory, assuming that since the information war is won, it is also possible to win the war on the battlefield. So if you look at the standard Ukrainian positions, they are also quite radical. Now, many in Kiev and beyond Kiev believe that the result of the conflict should be complete liberation of the Ukrainian territory, including the territory of Donbass and even Crimea, and that Ukraine is in a position to start a counteroffensive before too long, maybe already in summer. Ukraine, while it receives more weapons, more hardware from the West, while it receives more financial support, will be in a position to roll back the Russian offensive and to regain not only the territories that were lost after February 24th, but the territories that were lost back in 2014, namely the two breakaway republics of Donetsk and Lugansk, and arguably even the Crimean Peninsula. Of course, if this is the position of Ukraine, it makes it very difficult to find a compromise, and it hardens the positions of hawks in Moscow. So finally, I don't want to take too much of your time, but let me conclude with saying that those of us who stand for an immediate ceasefire believe that probably the current cycle of escalation, which imposes a high toll on both sides, will exhaust itself within the next couple of weeks. And maybe by the end of June or in early July, we will have a kind of natural pause in the military activities. And these pause might or might not be used for diplomatic negotiations. It's hard to tell whether we're right or wrong, whether indeed this conflict might lose its current steam in a couple of weeks. But if it happens, the two sides might get back to the table of negotiations, and on some issues, the previous round of negotiations, the negotiations that took place in Istanbul, provided some kind of potential for compromise, specifically on the new status, neutral status of Ukraine, on security guarantees to Ukraine. The two sides might agree to put some of the most divisive territorial issues on a back burner, and that might constitute an opportunity for a ceasefire and maybe even some political arrangement. The worst case scenario, in my view, and I will end up with that, is that there'll be some kind of truce without political settlement. So we will have a very shaky ceasefire, which will be interrupted by new cycles of escalation, and we will have something like what I would call the First World War on steroids, a kind of position warfare with parts of territories moving in this or that direction, but with no settlement. And this unfortunate situation might last for at least a couple of months, but maybe even a couple of years, with more casualties, with more destruction, with more problems for the two countries. And definitely this is something which will be a lose-lose situation for Russia and Ukraine. Let me stop here and let other panelists express their views. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. In fact, you have painted a kind of optimistic to a very, very pessimistic situation as far as the war is concerned. The Russia-Ukraine crisis could be like the First World War on steroids. That is something which is I'm hearing for the first time, and also the fact that the truce would be shaky, and which means that the escalations would continue in the future. Hope we are not staring at a situation of 2014 onward, what has been happening in the region, with a very, very shaky borders between the two sides. As you said, it is going to be a lose-lose situation for both Russia and Ukraine. With that, sir, thank you very much. We will take on the questions with you as we as we speak after the third speaker. We'll give the chance to the others as well. Thank you very much for a very, very candid and a forthright talk on this issue. We now invite Dr. Christin Fair. She's a professor in the Security Studies program within Georgetown University's Edmund A. Walsh School of Foreign Service. She previously served as a senior political scientist with RAND Cooperation, a political officer with United Nations Assistance Mission to Afghanistan in Kabul, and a senior research associate at USIP's Center for Conflict Analysis and Prevention. She has served as a senior fellow at West Point's Combating Terrorism Center, a senior resident fellow at the very own Institute of Defense Studies and Analysis, New Delhi, which is now known as Manohar Parrikar Institute of Defense Studies and Analysis. Her research focuses on political and military affairs in South Asia, which is Afghanistan, Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka. I always love to hear her speak on Pakistan. Her most recent book is, in their own words, Understanding the Lashkar-e-Taiba, Oxford University Press, which I have gone page by page. It's very interesting. I would recommend for everyone to kindly go through it. Previous books include Fighting to the End, the Pakistan Army's Way of War, Pakistan's Enduring Challenges, University of Pennsylvania, Press 2015. There is the next book. Policing Insurgencies, Cops as Counterinsurgents, Oxford University Press. Next book, Political Islam and Governance in Bangladesh, Routledge. She has also written Treading on Hallowed Ground, Counterinsurgency Operations in Sacred Spaces, Oxford University Press 2008. The Madrasas Challenge, Militancy and Religious Education in Pakistan, USIP 2008. And The Cousins of Axis of Evil and Other Irritating States, Global Pequot 2008, among others. Her current book project is Militant Piety and Lines of Control. Dr. Fair is a frequent commentator in print, New York Times, Foreign Affairs, Foreign Policy, the National Review, among others, as well as she appears on television and radio quite frequently. CBS, BBC, Al Jazeera, CNN, Voice of America, Fox, Reuters, BBC, NPR, amongst others. She is a member of the Women in International Security International Studies Association, American Political Science Association, and the American Institute of Pakistan Studies, and serves on the editorial board of numerous scholarly and policy analytic journals. She has a PhD from the University of Chicago, Department of South Asian Languages and Civilization, and an MA from Harris School of Public Policy, also at the University of Chicago. She speaks and reads Hindi, Urdu, and Punjabi. What a versatile personality. I think very rare to see. For a current list of publications, please visit her website, www.christinefair.net. I'm not trying to advertise her, but definitely she's a fountainhead of learning. Dr. Fair, we eagerly await to hear your side of the story, and over to you on this very contemporary issue, which is involvement of NATO in the war, end state in Ukraine, and the recommendations for West and Ukraine. Over to you, Dr. Fair.
So I'm going to apologize in advance because my internet connection is unstable, but I also want to thank you for letting me be here. And then I'm here on a student visa. So this means that I am very restricted in what I say, and I have to be very careful because I don't want to violate any of the that come with a student visa. So rather than offering my more characteristically unvarnished view of things, I think I would rather prefer to approach this as a series of puzzles. And so as a South Asianist, I have no expertise with regard to Russia or Ukraine. But as a South Asianist, what I have observed over the last several years is a really significant repositioning of Russia. And in this context, I think that this war had a lot of interesting questions for India. And so let me sort of what some of these realignments have been. Increasingly, when I look around this neighborhood, I see Russia and China basically colluding on policy positions on which the Russians don't necessarily have a direct interest. So for example, the Russians have co-vetoed any sort of punitive measures in the UN with regard to Myanmar. We don't talk about it that much because China essentially absorbs all of the airspace, but Russia is a junior partner in Afghanistan, right? Right now, there's only 3 embassies open in Afghanistan, and that's Pakistan, Russia. And then, of course, and I've been watching this, maybe I think it was going back to 2004 or 2005, Russia and Pakistan begun charting a different course. So after the Russian withdrawal from Afghanistan, there wasn't a lot of space to maneuver for Russia in Pakistan. So throughout the 1990s, there really wasn't a lot of direct development in their relationship. Ironically, 9/11 provided that space because initially Russia was a partner of the United States in the so-called terrorism. I'm just citing the name. My citing of the name doesn't mean I'm an advocate or a defender of it, but that's what it was called. And so this this triangulation that Pakistan also became a partner, as was Russia, this began to create a structure for Russian-Pakistan relations. And sometime in the mid-2000s, we began to see significant dialogues between Pakistan and Russian military and diplomatic representatives. And it obviously wasn't a secret that Imran Khan was in Russia when the offensive began. When I look at the region, I mean, if I were Indian, I would have a lot of questions about the sagacity of my current position. I mean, I sort of see over the long, of course, it's like, you know, turning an aircraft carrier. It takes a long time, but I am seeing a rearrangement of relations here in South Asia, where increasingly Russia and China are colluding. And India perforce, and it is perforce, even though India is not remotely a consumer of Russian hydrocarbons, India has a large conventional force posture. All of the Indian, the tri-services are completely dependent upon Russian system. And these forces are so large that it's comprehensible that India could, in any expeditious manner, move away from Russian supply. So, you know, you had mentioned, sir, the question of sanctions, and, you know, we're kind of in a new place with respect to using sanctions in this way. So it's pretty clear that not deterring Russian aggression in Ukraine. But what we are seeing is that it is having an effect on Russia's defense production capability. And of course, it's affected Ukraine. And these are primary sources for Indian spare parts. So I understand, I think everyone understands the India is treading. But aside from understanding, you know, I'm also really concerned, not because of my position as an American, but because as someone who is a well-wisher of India, is this going to be the kind of posture that you can sustain? And then if you see Russia and China colluding on the periphery on policy positions that are injurious, at what point does this make India sort of reconsider its position? Right. So as I said, I have a student visa, so I have to be very reserved in what I say and not get into any trouble with the MEA. So I'm just going to leave it here with those series of questions, and I understand that the next speaker is probably going to address many of them.
Thank you, ma'am. We were expecting a little more from you, but I understand that you are constrained by your visa, which you have got.
Yeah, no, when you emailed me, I told you I was on a student visa. I guess you didn't know how restrictive they are.
Yeah,
and they're very restrictive.
But I suppose you should be able to answer a few questions when they come up in the question answer sessions.
As long as they don't violate any rules of my being here.
Okay, thank you, ma'am. But you did refer to the impact as far as India is concerned because of the collusion between Russia and China, which is becoming more and more pronounced, even without any direct national interests of Russia, which is the example which you quoted was of Myanmar, and also Russia-Pakistan and Russia-Pakistan alignments by inference means Russia-Pakistan and China, which becomes a tri-party collusion against India. So that, of course, is a major worry as far as we are concerned in the region, and this war probably has made it even more closer. So to say, because of
don't forget Afghanistan. I mean, Russia is a de facto supporter of the Taliban. And you know, I know that the MEA is trying to come to some modus vivendi with the Taliban, but like you, I've watched the Taliban for a long time. They don't keep any of their promises.
Absolutely.
Right?
Although we are trying to work around with the Taliban as well, but hope we are successful in that, and possibly we have sent out some positive messages as far as Afghanistan is concerned. But that's a challenge, as you said. But challenge for our external affairs ministry, and and our external affairs minister is addressing these issues quite capably. But they are of a worry, definitely. We now move on to General Bhatia, who is our third speaker of today. General Bhatia superannuated after 40 years of distinguished service in the army as the Director General of Military Operations. As the DGMO, he was directly responsible for talks with his counterpart in Pakistan to ensure sustained ceasefire. Possibly at that point in time, ma'am, you were in Pakistan. A first of its kind, and was much appreciated by the national polity. He was instrumental in giving the much needed focus to the capability development and capacity enhancement along our northern borders and effective management of the line of actual control and line of control. Line of actual control is opposite China and line of control is opposite Pakistan. He is a proud alumni of Sainik School Ghodakhal and National Defense Academy, commissioned into the Parachute Regiment in June 1974. He is a graduate of Defense Services Staff College, College of Defense Management, and the prestigious National Defense College. He has wide-ranging experience in command, staff, and instructional appointments. Has higher command assignments include that of Mountain Brigade in North Bengal, Infantry Division on the line of control, and the Operational Corps along the India-China border. His operational experience is varied, as he has actually been part of Raksha, of Vijay, of Rhino, Hifazat, Orchid, Falcon, All Clear, and of course Operation Cactus, which was in Maldives. He has written on wide-ranging subjects such as regional and national security, international relations, and special operations. The general has also vast experience in disaster management. As a corps commander, he was responsible for the planning, deployment of resources, and execution of rescue, relief, and rehabilitation operations during the Sikkim earthquake of 18 September 2011. My son keeps thanking him for all the efforts which he and his corps made to actually save a lot of civilians during that crisis, during that earthquake. As the Director General Military Operations, he was also responsible for planning and execution of rescue and relief operations during one of the worst ever disasters in Uttarakhand in June 2013. He was also the co-chair of the India-US Executive Steering Group on Defense Cooperation. We could not have asked for a better person than him to speak on this important topic. I am saying preliminary lessons because the war is still on. And like as I said in the beginning, that we don't know which way the war is going to actually take. Is it going to linger on like this, like the 2014 conflict, or is it going to end after a month or so, as Dr. Kourtunov was referring to? But even that, he was saying that it's going to be very, very shaky. Possibly cycles of escalation, de-escalation will continue. So a very, very challenging task for you, sir, to peep into the future as well as give out some lessons learned and also give some recommendations. Maybe they are interim recommendations, and maybe you could add a caveat to that, that these are, as usual, future gazing with a little bit of caveat attached to it, that it might not follow the trend which you are trying to project. So over to you, sir, General Bhatia, and you can take about 20 odd minutes for your discourse, sir. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, General Dushyant. Thank you very much. Good morning and a Jai Hind to everyone. Number of people out here. Thank you, Stripe. It's always been a pleasure and honor to be on the Stripe platform. I must, Team Stripe, I must compliment them for putting Lucknow on the strategic map of India and the world also. Coming after two very eminent, very prominent speakers, I got a tough task, and I was prepared for 10 to 12 minutes, and General Dushyant has just increased it 20, so I'll have to innovate. Innovation, of course, is a soldier's birthright. Talking about the Ukraine war. No, it's a very interesting topic. There's more to see than meets the eye. So I will try and see what is not normally seen. No, firstly, it is 16 weeks into the war, and I will not call it a Russian invasion of Ukraine. Let me just call it a war. And some of us, including me, are still hoping to find answers to what should have been a very short, swift, straight, smart war. And it continues, and it is continues. That is a lesson to be learned is that the war of attrition, irrespective of the technologies, irrespective of the vast devastation, which destruction which the weapons can cause, attrition still continues to be a part of war, and linear wars are still very much a part of a conflict. It has disturbed the world peace. It disturbs the economy, food, energy security of the world. There's been mass migration, and the lessons we learned out there. The countries the world over failed to see the outcomes, and are still groping to arrive at the strategic intent and aims of various stakeholders. However, my brief is mainly the impact of India, and I will try and see what it's all about India. We as military men, soldiers, we all used to a fog of war. But as I see the current situation in Russia and Ukraine, which is unfolding, is not fog of war, it is the whiteout conditions. There's so much of chaos, so much of misinformation, so much of information to sift through and to arrive at logical deductions at present is well nigh impossible for anyone, including the best strategists. When you talk to the people who have come from there, we've done reasonably well. We brought 22,000 students on there. When you talk to the various media, journalists who have been covering the war, they have a different take, and they give their own perception, whether right or wrong, I'm not too sure. But the experiences talk of something else. And I see Russia showing some restraint, limiting the collateral damage, not going all out, because if Russia had gone all out, I think the war should have moved much more. So the strategic intent of Russia may be to prolong the war, because if Russia wants, they can finish the war soon. However, it's a win-win for a number of other regions. We have China in the landscape. Whether Russia wins or loses, whether Ukraine wins or loses, whether the Americans in the West win or loses, one thing is certain that China will gain, China will win. So that is the underlying certainty that China, it's a key certainty China will win either. Coming down to India. Now, India, as we see, is a risen, responsible, resilient nation, a rising power, a regional power, a global leader. And in the context of Ukraine and the war, we find there were a number of high-profile visits to New Delhi, be it the Americans, be it the Europeans, be it the Russians, and even the Chinese. There were many high-profile visits. So that shows the emerging of India as an accepted power in the world, though we are not part of the high table in any case right now. We're not part of the elite groups, elite clubs, which we should have been, but we are not. However, the reach of India, diplomatic, political, and backed by the military, has been recognized. We have a number of high-profile visits, and each one telling us to intervene, to do things. Also, the whirlwind tour of Prime Minister Modi to the European countries, the 5-day tour, which he had about 28, 29 meetings, also spoke about, and he was received by the heads of states of all nations, of course, also speaks about our growing relevance among the community of nations in the emerging world order or emerging world disorder, as I see it right now. So that is where India stands. General Harsh Kakar, my old colleague, covered the middle path which India has taken. I would like to say that India has looked after its national interest. It's not a middle path. India has shown the capability, demonstrated the capability of not taking sides, but taking its own side for once. We not sat on a moral high ground. We don't need to. Our national interests come first. We have 1.38 billion people. The well-being is at stake. We have energy security, food security, which is our priority. There's rising inflation in the country. So there are a number of other things which come to me. Russia, of course, as was covered by Christin, we depend on Russian military hardware. About 60% plus Russian military hardware is on our inventories. And that has also given us a lesson to move towards, give impetus to Atmanirbhar or self-reliance in defense manufacturing. So these are some of the lessons we learned. It has to give impetus because the world is changing. I also see the Russia-China strategic partnership, which we should take note of, the 4th of February strategic partnership between Russia and China, a relationship without limits, right? So what does it imply for India? Because all said and done, China is a major adversary. China is going on to forward deployment along the line of actual control. We have contested the border with China. China has certain strategic vulnerability and concern in the Indian Ocean. We are two Asian giants. China would like to contain us, and many things with China. And we are banking on Russian military hardware to be for a defense preparedness, for operational readiness, because operational readiness and defense preparedness is important to ensure peace, especially with China, which believes in military cohesion, whether it's India-China border, the South China Sea, Taiwan, or even Koreas, or even smaller countries like Philippines, Malaysia, Indonesia, Vietnam. So we will have to take that into account. We have to take our national interests into account, and our national interests are basically looking at our own territorial integrity, our own well-being, and protecting and projecting our interests, our security. India has also demonstrated that we are capable of looking after our. I'm giving the positive first. It's not that we don't have negatives. We do have negatives. We have demonstrated a capability of protecting our interests abroad by evacuating 22,000 students from Ukraine amidst war. And that I think was an operation we should be proud of, getting them all back, all safely except for one student. So that is something, a lesson learned, is that we do have the capability at the political, diplomatic, and military level to get to look after our citizens anywhere, both assets and citizens anywhere in the world. The independent stance has also sent a signal to various stakeholders, especially the US and the West, that India will not be leveraged. Coming back to China and Russia, China, as we all know, seeks a bipolar world, challenge the US as emerging world order, and India seeks a multipolar world. So what does the Ukraine war now translate? Like I said earlier, China, it's a win-win for China. Is China now looking at Taiwan? Is China looking at India-China border? Is China looking at South China Sea? Or is it looking simultaneously at everything with Pakistan as a client state, encirclement of the strategic encirclement, what we call the string of pearls with India? And what does India need to do to deter China's aggressive behavior, especially along the line of actual control? So that would remain the key challenges for India coming out of the lessons from the war in Russia and Ukraine, or war in Ukraine rather. We will have to look at the economic impact of the war on India, the food security aspects also. There is rising inflation. There are problems, domestic problems with rising inflation. We also have to look at the military lessons, right? Because that's very, very, very important when you look at the military lessons. When you look at China, Russia, with Russian equipment, and we have one nation who has exploited all types of equipment. We have Russian equipment, we have American military hardware, Israel, French, Swedish, British. So, and we have exploited all this, but it's time for our own thing. So when you look at the military lessons to be learned, is that we need optimal hardware manufactured in India with I must say, capabilities to enhance the production capacities and be a net exporter in the next 10 to 15 years. Another lesson I think we need to learn, and learn it very, very fast, based on our own experience also, is in the information war domain. Information war has been a very major tool. We look at information war from not only the military domain, from the political domain also, and especially when we talk of China, when we talk of Pakistan, information war is what Pakistan carried in Jammu and Kashmir, and China carried in India. So we need information war systems and structures to understand and exploit this new domain of warfare. In the emerging world order, India becomes a balancing power. The world order, or the world disorder, is based on balance of power, and India needs to be looking at the balance of interest rather than balance of power, or rather, I would say, a balance between the balance of power and balance of interest would serve India purpose. We cannot isolate the two, but definitely, unlike the other major powers who look at the balance of interest, because it's the new rivalry, the new big rivalry which is going on between Russia and China on one side and the Western world on the other side, backed by America. So India should be looking at the balance of interests, and that is exactly we have done. We have projected ourselves not as a middle path, but looking at a balance of interest. What interests India is the primary concern. We also have to look at the military spends we have got. We have to transit. We have to carry out a good transition from dependence on Russian equipment, especially to our own equipment. How this transition works out. We have had this list coming out banning imports from various countries, but at the same time, we need to be present relevant and future ready. So how we carry out the balance is a lesson learned from this particular war. Nuclear weapons. Now, there's something we don't talk about, nuclear weapons, but I feel that with the war going on and on, the numerical strength of the nuclear weapons among the 9 nuclear armed states is growing. And we also will need to match, especially as we live in an Asian neighborhood with both our adversaries with massive nuclear weapons. Actually, both China and Pakistan got more nuclear weapons, and always keeps threatening India with the use of nuclear weapons. India has, of course, draft a policy of first use. As far as soldiering is concerned, we look at the Russian tactics. I find Russia has gone in for whatever pictures which are emanating from there, in the open media, on the social media. I don't see Russia doing tactical or operational maneuvers. So the tanks are too close for comfort. They're moving line astern, moving on the roads. There are no tactical formations. And Russia, for that matter, we must understand how they are fighting this war. They are fighting this war in a very deliberate manner. I think they're prolonging the war, possibly, in my belief, to make sure that Europe suffers from more and more migrants. So 7.7 million migrants already supposed to have migrated to other East European nations, maximum to Poland, and another 8 million have been displaced. So Russia is using this as a strategy to achieve its political objectives of a regime change, of a friendly Ukrainian population, especially in the east and the south. So we'll have to look at, not only when we look at wars, we'll have to look at not allying the population, because the population is not going to go anywhere. They're going to be there, most of them. So these are some of the lessons which I think we have to take home from this particular war. Coming back to a few words about the key questions which may be answered by the co-panelists. Why is Russia doing what it is doing? It still is a key question which I have, because I still feel as a military man doing the military capabilities of Russia and Ukraine. It's a win-win situation again for Russia and for America, because the very massive military industrial complex of the US after Afghanistan has got orders of $43 billion. So who is there to lose in this? Countries like Ukraine, countries like Russia. Russia cannot fight an indefinite war, definitely not. Countries in the region, especially countries like India, with a large population to support. So what exactly is happening out there, and who are the main sufferers? Will it be Ukraine? Will it be Europe? Will it be Russia alone? And China as a gainer, and China when it emerges, whatever it is. How, if Russia wanted to limit the expansion of NATO, it's not happening, because Finland and Sweden want to join the NATO now. So there's some basic strategic questions, the political objectives of Russia, the political objectives of the US, of Europe, which are which are going to be questioned, and what we don't see is what needs to be seen. It is what is seen is very easy to define, very easy to comprehend. But there are a number of things which we do not see, and that is why I think Strive has done a wonderful job by telling us about the war and what we don't see. I think I'll end out here. I've taken my time. Thank you very much. I'll wait any clarifications and what I want to know in the learning experience from you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, sir. And thanks for having, first of all, covered a very wide canvas. You have also left us, like the others, with questions and questions, which goes to prove that the complexity of the Russia-Ukraine war. You know, China is a factor which we need to consider. Like you said, it wants to create a bipolar world. India wants to create a multipolar world. But how should India go about creating a multipolar world is the challenge as far as we are concerned. There are deluge of questions. In fact, the chat box is full of questions. I don't know how to handle them, but I will now request my panelists, as also there are some eminent speakers in the participants also, to chip in to answer these questions to the best of their abilities, including Dr. Fair. The questions are far too many, and this is a Chetam House rule, so we will not be letting out anything from here without your permission. That is the assurance which we are giving. I will try to club these questions because there are far too many of them. First question which is coming up is from Air Marshal Tiwari. Okay. Air Marshal Tiwari says, we have seen the result of war in Ramada and Aleppo, where the entire city was devastated. The war in Iraq, Afghanistan, and Syria was ruthless. The same kind of destruction is not seen in Ukraine. The infrastructure is more or less not destroyed and is functional. So do you think that Russia is fighting with some kind of restraint, and the reason for it, is it a case where a political and military aim are not exactly matching? I think the best person for this would be Dr. Andrew Kourtunov, sir. Maybe have your views on this, sir. And if Air Marshal Tiwari would like to add thereafter, we will unmute your microphone, sir.
Thank you, sir. Just one last line. That is there any lesson for us to learn that in any future conflict, both these aims should match exactly? Because understanding or knowing the Russian military capability, it is beyond comprehension that why they are taking so long until they are fighting with one hand tied behind their back. Thank you.
Right, sir. May I request Dr. Kourtunov to answer that question, please?
Thank you for the question. Let me start with a caveat that, of course, we cannot compare Ukraine to Syria. And whether we talk about Aleppo or Raqqa, but definitely destructions in Syria were much higher. However, having said that, I should also confess that destructions in Ukraine are significant if you take what is left from the city of Mariupol. Frankly, it's not much. So I think that definitely urban warfare has certain rules, and we see them manifesting themselves in Ukraine as well. However, I think that indeed we can argue that Russians cannot afford the luxury of taking the same approach in Ukraine in terms of indiscriminate destruction of the urban infrastructure. And I think that it tells us a lot about the future of military conflicts in this century. It seems that in these conflicts, the high-tech component will be of paramount importance. Precision will be more important than firepower. And targeting CQ by these factors become really very critical in terms of warfare in large metropolitan areas. If you look at the situation in Ukraine, you'll see that Russia avoids trying to capture big cities with the population of 1 million people or more. Places like Kharkov, Kiev, Odessa are not regarded as direct military targets. Even if you look at the Russian air campaign, you'll see a lot of constraints. Russia is avoiding targeting not only the civilian infrastructure, but even the civilian transportation system. And for me, it is a little bit odd because that doesn't allow Russia to intercept the inflows of heavy weapons that Ukraine gets from the West. But apparently this is the tactics that has been chosen by the Russian general staff. If this conflict can be regarded as a sample for wars to come, I think the technological race in the military field becomes of a paramount importance. As I said, precision. This is something which will be extremely important in the warfare of the future. Now, just in terms of India, let me tell you that, of course, if you look at the developments in Asia from the Kremlin, they should be concerned about the state of the Russian-Indian relations. And let me remind you that the first trip that President Putin made abroad after the COVID pandemic was not to Beijing, it was to Delhi. It was December of last year. So there is, I think, a recognition that this relationship is very important and that Russia should not somehow trade this relationship for a stronger partnership with China, not to mention Pakistan. I think it is clear, and it will remain the case. India is simply too important. If you take the Indian position in the conflict between Russia and Ukraine, I think the position is well balanced. Maybe some people in Moscow would like India to to take a more active role in mediating, because India can be an honest broker in this conflict, and Prime Minister Modi is a person who is very respected in both Russia and Ukraine. One of the recent messages I got from Kiev was that in Ukraine, they would be interested in seeing India as one of the security guarantors to Ukraine after the war is over. Whether India is ready to play this role, whether it is in a position to play this role, it's not up to me to answer. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. We will take on the next question. Now, this is from Mrs. Nidhi Bahugana to Dr. Fair directly, a lady to a lady. Dr. Fair, can Indian engagement with Russia affect Russian engagement with China? And since you are a South Asia expert, I think you're free to answer this. Does India have a foothold via engagement with Iran and Russia in their engagement with China? Would you like to answer, ma'am?
Yeah, sure. I mean, again, I have to be really careful because of the status of my visa. So I'm not going to be my usual blunt self. I'm going to be more circumspect. So I would turn the question around to ask, does the questioner believe that India has basically outpositioned China in the countries that she's mentioned? You know, I've been a long proponent of the Indo-Iranian relationship, principally the development of the port at Chabahar, because Afghanistan has to have an alternative port to those ports that are in Pakistan. I'm not saying that should have displaced Karachi or potentially Gwadar, but just diversifying the options so that Afghanistan wasn't so beholden to a country that wants to enslave it. For better or for worse, after Trump withdrew from the JCPOA, India basically accommodated President Trump and retrenched from its position in Iran. So from my point of view, that's been very disappointing. And even prior to that, of President Trump, China was also already outcompeting India. And in fact, my understanding is that the Indians, if you guys don't get your act together, we're just gonna let China take this project over. So where I'm sitting with the limitations that I have, which I've already, stated, I don't think India is outcompeting China. I actually think China is running circles around India. Whether you look at Djibouti, whether you look at Sri Lanka, and part of it is just resources. And China does business. China is essentially mercantilist colonizer, right, using the debt trap to secure access to countries that are of strategic importance. So I think the real question is, from my point of view, is India enough to Russia that it will not enable China to do something truly injurious to Indian interests? And not being an expert on Russia, I don't really feel like I can answer that question. It's a question that I have for myself empirically.
To some extent, Dr. Andrew Kourtunov did mention that the Russia-India relations would be not at the cost of China or Pakistan. So maybe
well, I mean, Putin says a lot of things.
Yes. So,
and we know the outcome of his claims. So as a scholar, I have to remain empirically wary,
okay.
right? And I think I'm pretty risk averse in my assessment, so no one would ever accuse me of being optimistic. But I also think it's good to plan for the worst case scenario. Right? Do we expect to see a different Russian position, for example, on the border dispute with China? I don't know. But if I were Indian, looking at the rearrangement around the neighborhood, that's something that I would be very worried about. Might Russia seek to take, revenge on India for not taking a more pro-Kremlin position, right? So these are the things that I would be worrying about, in addition to the things that Lieutenant General Bhatia mentioned, dependence upon Russia for spare parts. The other thing I would raise that I wanted to observe with respect to the question posed to Dr. Kourtunov is that, you can't really compare what's happening to Ukraine with what happened in Syria. One, this was, to my understanding, and correct me if I'm wrong, Air Marshal, Russia's campaign in Syria was an air war, right? There weren't troops on the ground. And I think what's been really surprising to those of us who study counterinsurgency is that many of us had really thought that the Russian forces were much more capable. And what we're actually is, and this is something I think is really relevant for India, we're not seeing well-coordinated from the Russian forces. And we're also seeing low morale. We're seeing Russians defecting. We are seeing things that are not typically indicative of a military force, right? And then, of course, the very nature of the infrastructure isn't itself comparable. But this is also, I would say, a test ground, right, for Russian forces and the equipment that they have. Like, I've been quite interested in the French artillery, the long-range artillery that's been introduced into the Ukrainian space. This is going to be a good opportunity for India to take a hard look at its weapon systems. Leave aside the nature of the Pakistani conflict. It's really the China conflict that I'm worrying about.
Okay. Thank you, ma'am. It's good to know the worst case situation, and I think India would do well to remain cognizant of all these aspects. Of course, that is for the policy makers. We can only air our thoughts and views. I have another very interesting question, which is coming from General Sudhakar ji. He's first of all complimented you. Why Western powers are doing everything to prolong the ongoing conflict despite economic recession due to the COVID-19 pandemic in the world, as also the Indo-Pacific seems to be the obvious and a new conflict zone after a humiliating withdrawal from Afghanistan to contain China. So this is a question which I leave it to the I open it to the panelists, and if the panelists feel otherwise, it will also be open to. There are some scholars in our midst in the participants list, which is very long. In fact, we have shut the gate. There has been a cyber attack on our discussion, so we are trying to control the influx of people who are trying to get into this in this group. So anybody who would like to answer from the three panelists, would you try, ma'am?
Actually,
Since it is
I would
directly.
very briefly. I was kind of surprised by this question. I don't think we are trying to prolong the conflict. We don't want to see a democracy fall to autocracy. And if I were an Indian, that the Western powers would come to the defense of Indian democracy if you face an overwhelming threat from, let's just say, one of its northern neighbors. So this isn't about prolonging the conflict. Ukrainians don't want to be a part of Russia, with the exception of some significant areas that have been discussed on the border. Ukrainians want to be a part of the West. And so I don't really understand this particular characterization. I'm pretty sure that if India were to be attacked by China and your very way of life and your democracy were at stake, you might have a different view. You might actually want people to come to your help. And I'm pretty confident that that's how most Ukrainians feel. The very fact that we see Ukrainians fighting with such verve, that we're seeing grandmothers, guns, that we're seeing grandmothers approaching Russian soldiers and telling them to put some sunflower seeds in their pockets. I believe that this is fairly dispositive evidence that Ukrainians want their freedom. I'm pretty sure Indians would want their freedom too if they were to be invaded by a massive imperial power to the north.
You're right, ma'am. Thank you very much for responding to that question. Anybody else would like to add on to any other reasons why this conflict is being prolonged? Actually, the question is the other way around. It is also being said that Russians are deliberately trying to prolong the conflict for reasons which are related to food and energy issues. So anybody else who would like to dilate on this issue? Yes, sir. Bhatia, sir. Go ahead, sir.
Yeah, I think as a military man, the Russians, I will feel, are prolonging this, and there are economic reasons also to this. If you look at economic aspects, the Russians have earned 43 billion euros in the last 100 days from Europe itself, and it's estimated that they'll get another 300 billion euros from energy, from oil and gas in this particular year. So they're putting pressure on Europe. I think that there are too many questions still unanswered, but definitely one thing is certain, that if Russia wants to finish the war, it can finish the war. If you look at the statements of 15th of June, the conversation between the two leaders, Putin of Russia and Xi Jinping of China, where China has again come out in support of Russia. At 16th of June, the heads of state of France, Germany, Italy visit Ukraine, and they say something totally different. What they say is that they only see two outcomes. The two outcomes are a victory for Ukraine. I don't know how that is possible, honestly, and a negotiated settlement between the two nations, that is between Russia and Ukraine. So there are very hardened positions being taken, and the main thing is that I think in this whole game, the major losses will be definitely Ukraine is a pawn, actually. Ukraine's thing. The major losses would be for both Eastern Europe mainly, some part of Europe, and the gainers would be number one, China, number two, the US, and Russia. So this game is going on. I hope I am out there. And India will have to, again, like I said earlier, we'll need a very fine balance. Very, very easy for you to say that India should mediate. There's a question saying India should, use influence of Russia to win over China. How do you do that? Russia needs China more than Russia needs India. That's a fact of life. Right. On 4th of February, Putin visits China just before this thing, Olympic Games. And I think Putin, Xi Jinping told Putin, please don't start anything till the games are on. Right. So that is why it starts on the 24th of February, 23rd February being the Russian Armed Forces Day. So these are very minor indicators, but it's easy to say that India should, and India is doing well. I think we continue to have our own place in the among the nations, the diplomatic space. And we're doing reasonably well. What we need to do is, like the old saying, horses for races and horses for courses. We should have one foreign policy for all. Our foreign policy should be India-centric. It should be, when dealing with the Russians, we should have one foreign policy. With the West one, with the Chinese another one, with the Gulf region another one. Why not? After all, you can't have one foreign policy based on IDD alone. Something which India has been doing for too long, and the change is come about. And today we are a nation which world has to respect. There's no other way, and we should exploit that respect, exploit our position, exploit our economic situation. We should exploit ourselves and our need to other nations. Everyone wants India to come and play a mediator role. Well, we should play. We want peace. There's no doubt about it. We want negotiate settlement, but not at our cost, please.
Thank you, sir. There are two raised hands, so I would like to give them also a chance. First, I have Jan Sharma, and then I have Jan NB Singh. Sir, quick question, oblique comments, if you have any, do share. First, we'll have Jan Sharma, and then we'll have Jan NB, sir.
Thank you. Thank you, General Chauhan. Thank you very much. You see, my analysis is that if at all this conflict favors anyone, it is United States of America. Neither it favors Russians nor the Chinese. And if you look at the events since the fall of Berlin Wall, and then the fragmentation of Soviet Union, and the expansion of NATO, the color revolution, and abrogation all the treaties which US had with Russians. Put it together and look at the psyche of Russians. How will they think and behave then when the NATO and US presences come as close as 300 kilometers from St. Petersburg? So sovereignty was definitely a matter for Russians, and they were being put on the edge. And this is part of a great game. What has Americans gained from the whole thing? Your Euro-Atlantic alliance today, which was very fragile, has been reconsolidated. You have given a new birth to NATO, and you are gingering up today relationship with East Asian Security Alliance and with NATO and other things. So it's a new phase of America's effort to regain its primacy, if not in Eurasia, at least in the Indo-Pacific. And in Eurasia, you create a distraction both for China and for Russia. Now, the issue here is that Russians cannot actually sustain a very prolonged conflict. They've been isolated and it is hurting their economy. But their national pride is so profound and they will not let it go so easily, whatever be the cost. Look at the historical experience. As far as China is concerned, how is it going to gain? Its major enabler of China dream, that is Belt and Road Initiative, and the center of gravity of it passed through Ukraine, that is totally hemmed in. And it has given a very big setback to Chinese themselves. In regard to India, I think our dilemmas will persist because it's very difficult for us to balance out our interest in Eurasia vis-a-vis our interest in Indo-Pacific. And whatever interest we have in Indo-Pacific, they cannot be bargained at the cost of our interest in Eurasia. Otherwise, we will shrink ourselves to be only a rimland power and not a continental power. But that's a larger issue. it also throws up lessons for us, at least two lessons. The nature of warfare that India is going to beset on our western border, where you have very high terrain friction, you have built up areas, you have hostile population, and you have an ecosystem of terrorism. All this put together, we need to rethink our actually proactive or so-called military operation strategy vis-a-vis China. We cannot fight our next war on western border in the way that we have been planning so far. And my last point is, irrespective of what you think, presently our dependency on Russia is up to about 64% of our spares. It's very, very difficult for us to make a tilt away from Russia towards a multiple sources, which are whether US, Israel, Germany, France, or any other country. So your Russian dilemma is likely to persist, and therefore India would always have to balance. And there is a risk of, actually, if we do not navigate our foreign policy, we may end up losing credibility and annoying both sides. So that's a very big challenge that we have to grapple with. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. In fact, we are closing in on time, and the questions and the views of people are increasing by the time as we are going ahead. I myself have some questions which need answering from this August gathering. Possibly we will have another one session, but since I had promised that I will allow General NB, and thereafter there are two more hands. I think we will take those three will be the last views, and thereafter we will conclude this session. Yes, General NB, sir, you can go ahead.
Thank you, General Dushyant. Since the time is less, I'll not beat around the bush. I'll not count the trees, go straight for the forest. The macro issue is global domination. My simple question is, why is NATO creeping towards Russian border? This has been covered in detail by many speakers. When Russian Federation was created, Soviet Union broke down, there was very clear single superpower. Then the talk of multiple superpowers started coming up. But then that was not to the, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you. Go ahead, sir.
Am I audible?
Yes,
okay.
sir.
So what I'm saying, with a single superpower, America is never happy. They ever and ever want a domination, superpower domination. They're entering to Afghanistan, entering to Iraq, entering in Middle East, Indo-Pacific. Their interest coincides with our interest, so I'll speak less on that. There possibly it is the other way around, China, which is going for over domination of the Pacific region. Somebody has to counter it. But in Europe, there was a very clear stabilization of situation after Soviet Union broke down. And there was no conflict of interest anywhere except till the Russians came into Crimea. But then again, the Americans won't swallow it. Some of the things that media is missing out, and we have also missed out, Ukraine in its factories, the amount of research on some of the chemicals, some viral developments, some biological development that was taking place, it has not been publicized. It was all with the American budget. Why was it taking so close to the Russian border? Have you forgotten the Bay of Pigs conflict? The way the US reacted when the Russians wanted to send missiles to Cuba? Why is NATO then getting into Finland, Sweden, and wants to get into Ukraine? Earlier, some of your panelists did cover this issue, that a peace will prevail with a political guarantee, security guarantee to Ukraine, and NATO not trying to expand its wings closer to the Russian border. I think that's the only macro issue that I want to make.
Thank you, sir.
Rest, there are many smaller issues.
Yeah, I agree,
Thanks.
sir. There are enough participants who want to share their views. In fact, this was a similar question which was there in the chat box, which Sudhakar had asked. So I hope, Sudhakar, your views have been expressed. We will ask the views of the panelists on this particular issue.
Only one small point, sir, if you allow me, please, sir.
Please take 1 minute only, because that's the time I'm giving
Yes.
to you.
Since I'm across 7 seas and I take the pride in getting connected to Strive, firstly, compliments for having conducted such a wonderful contemporary talk and deliberation, sir. My question is, between the disease and the symptom, if we have to, if the global order is looking for a solution to an ongoing conflict, what is the disease? Many speakers, preceding speakers and the panelists have highlighted, and I compliment General N.B. Singh as also General Sharma, that they have actually hit the nail on the nail itself. The basic disease that I diagnose is that after the Cold War ended, the Warsaw Pact was dissolved. Why wasn't any permanent security architecture decided and crystallized at the end of it? Why was it left open-ended? The basic issue of expansion of NATO is attributed to this particular phenomenon, because of which Russia has been compelled to actually go in for striking and creating its security to the sovereignty. Back to you, sir. Thank you.
Thank you, Sudhakar. I think this issue has been highlighted by General NB, by you. Amongst the panelists, would anyone like to quickly satisfy their anxieties?
I would just like to offer an alternative view.
Yeah.
So what I hear here among many of the people who have spoken is this idea of an amoeba-like NATO that's going in and gobbling up countries on the periphery.
Absolutely.
No, there's another way of seeing it that I would encourage those who have this view to consider, that Ukraine wanted to be a part of NATO. NATO actually did not immediately acquiesce Ukraine's numerous requests. There were a number of conditions that Ukraine had to meet. NATO was very concerned about corruption. So if NATO looking for countries to gobble up, it should have jumped at the chance to include Ukraine, as opposed to having Ukraine meet a series of metrics. The other issue is that those that have joined NATO subsequent to the collapse of the Soviet Union have done so because they have observed Russian behavior in Belarus and elsewhere, and they would like security guarantees against it. So I think the prevailing view amongst the speakers that I've heard is one of supply, that NATO is going out and trying to countries into its orbit. But look, and I'm not a defender of US foreign policy. People who know me know this.
Absolutely.
I was a vocal opponent, right?
Yes.
A vocal opponent of the Iraq War. I hollered and screamed at every misstep in Afghanistan. So I'm not someone who, I'm not a nationalist, right? But I think that you should also be aware that there are many countries who want to join NATO because they are afraid of Putin and Putin's Russia. And so if you're not considering alternative explanations, then you're not approaching this what I in an empirically fair way, but rather you're approaching this with political priors. And I to the best of my ability, I try to avoid doing that.
Thank you.
Could I also make a comment on that?
Yes, go ahead, sir.
Well, I don't want to start a discussion here. Let me only remind you that the enlargement of NATO to the east started long before Putin got to power. It was in 1990s under President Yeltsin, who was very friendly to the West. So I would respectfully question the assumption that the expansion took place only because Putin turned out to be.
I'm not making an assumption.
But it's not what it's
I'm
not
saying
what
it's supply and demand.
Yeah, no, I agree.
Supply
I agree
and
with that.
demand is what it is.
Yes, that's right. I agree with that. But let me just say a few words about the Western position in this current conflict. My take is that the West and the United States, in particular, has to choose between the two objectives, which might be overlapping but not identical. The first objective would be to punish Putin. And the second objective would be to resolve the conflict. If the main goal is to punish Putin and to punish Russia, then the West should encourage Ukraine to fight till the last Ukrainian. It should continue to pour weapons, and it should act as a cheerleader, saying that Ukraine, you will win, you know. Another effort, another month, another year, and you will retake Donbass and Crimea. And this is what I see coming from the West. If the idea is to resolve the conflict, it implies certain compromises, maybe even not perfect compromises, because it is a choice between what I would call, after Weber, the ethics of conviction and the ethics of responsibility. For the time being, I don't see in the West, especially in the United States, any inclination to work towards a compromise. I might be wrong, maybe that's my personal view, but I think that this choice has to be made. Thank you.
I got, in fact, disconnected for a while because of a poor connection, but hopefully the others have heard the response of Dr. Kourtunov. We will straight away go to the last raised hand. Rishi, you can go ahead and ask your question, and thereafter we will try to conclude. Okay.
Thank you very much, General Dushyant Singh, and thank you very much to Strive for arranging this webinar. And we've had a galaxy of global speakers from Russia, from the US, and from India. For a start, there has been an unfortunate cyber attack, and I think this is an object lesson. Zoom is a Chinese software. Nobody should ever use Zoom. The question is really to do with the fact that Ukraine did give up its nuclear arsenal. But Ukraine perhaps already had a good level of Soviet era conventional weapons and perhaps continued to expand its arsenal. So really speaking, is Ukraine actually itself militarily better equipped than Russia expected? And is this war really going to end? Is it kind of like almost like two equal nuclear apart, two well-armed powers fighting? In the sense, Ukraine is not necessarily weak, or even without Western weapons, is Ukraine strong enough at least to resist Russia reasonably? That's my main question. Thank you. And all three panelists can speak, and I'll rest my question here. Thank you, sir.
Okay. Any views, Dr. Kourtunov? Would you like to say that Ukraine did have the capacity to resist Russia? This is essentially what Rishi is alluding to.
Well, you know, I think that definitely we should not underestimate the resilience of the Ukrainian society and the Ukrainian resistance. I think that if there were calculations that in Moscow that Ukraine would fall apart right after the beginning of the operation, these expectations turned out to be completely incorrect. However, I think that right now, when you know, we are in the end of the 4th month of the war, it would be very difficult to imagine that Ukraine could continue its resistance without an inflow of heavy weapons from the West, because the Ukrainian defense capacity is not limitless, and it is clearly inferior to what Russia can bring to the battlefield. So the Western support is critical to provide for the Ukrainian resistance, and we will see whether this support might or might not be the game changer. And finally, let me say that in terms of nuclear weapons, of course, right now it is hard to speculate about what could have happened if Ukraine had not abandoned its nuclear weapons. But my personal take is that it was extremely difficult for Ukraine to maintain its nuclear arsenal in 1990s during the transition period. It would take enormous efforts by the Ukrainian leaders to maintain Ukraine as a nuclear country. So risks were very high, and the pressure, not only from Russia, but from the international community at large, including the United States under the Bush and later under the Clinton administration, was very high to convince Ukraine to get rid of nuclear weapons. So I think that it was very difficult to imagine that Ukraine could resist this pressure.
Thank you very much, sir. I think We are already 10 minutes past our scheduled time of 12:30. And since we have global audience, global participation here, we will respect their time schedule. With that, we will conclude this webinar. And my final take on the webinar is that all the points which have been agitating in the minds of people remain possibly somewhat unanswered. I hope there is some amount of clarity which has come in. There were two issues which one of the participants had raised, and they are very close to me because they were part of my thesis when I was in the United States of America. And this was about personalities and ideologies. Is the personalities also a very prominent factor in the war prolonging the way it is prolonging, or it could have been different had the personalities been different? In some form or the other, these have been answered both by the Russian speaker, Dr. Andrew Kourtunov, and the US speaker, Dr. Fair. Both have alluded to Putin, but I think there is an equal amount of emphasis required to study Zelensky's personality. I think somewhere both have contributed to this war going beyond what it is today, or what people would have expected it to be. So this being one, and the second one was about ideology. Again, Dr. Fair referred to this, that it's about what is happening there. It's about democracy, and it's about the other thought of the people of Eastern Europe possibly didn't want to be with the Russian lineup, which possibly history will, future will tell us what have been the real reasons. But yes, there has been a perspective which is there in the country, that is in India, that NATO expansion has been one of the factors possibly which pushed Russia to take such an action, because as Dr. Kourtunov said, that the expansion of NATO was happening from way back in 1995 onwards. So therefore, that time Putin wasn't there. Putin came much later. These being some of the issues which caused a little bit of heightened discussions between the participants, as also between the learned speakers. And that's the whole idea about webinars. The idea is to throw around these ideas, come to a conclusion, and see as to what could be the best way to resolve this crisis. I like the idea of Dr. Kourtunov saying that there would be possibly a scope after the next round of a temporary truce, which may give diplomacy a chance. With that, I would like to, on behalf of our chairman, General Abhi Parmar, would like to thank our distinguished eminent speakers, Dr. Kourtunov, Dr. Fair, and General Bhatia, who, despite being told in the last minute that you have to speak for 20 minutes, he covered a very wide canvas, covering issues which were related to India, of direct concern to India. How will India ensure that it sees a multipolar world rather than a bipolar world, is a question, I think, which was very relevant as far as he raised it. I would also like to thank Jan Sharma, who gave out his thoughts on who will be the winner in this war. Ultimately, in his perspective, possibly it's the US, not China and Russia. So as you can see, there are complexities in this whole. And in any case, geopolitics is a very complex subject. Political scientists continue to study various conflicts which are taking place all over the world, and answers are not simple. They have their both sides. One has to choose which is the right side. With that, sir, thank you once again to each one of you, each of our speakers, and the participants on this platform, as well as on Facebook and YouTube. Thank you very much. Thanks for joining us. Jai Hind, Jai Bharat.
Thank you very much, Jai